In recent weeks, the Trump administration has found itself at the center of multiple high-profile controversies, from the bungled release of redacted Jeffrey Epstein documents to the behind-the-scenes intervention in Andrew Tate's legal situation, all while overseeing mass federal layoffs. At first glance, these issues seem unrelated, each tied to different aspects of law, justice, and economic policy. But when examined through the lens of intent rather than outcome, a clear strategy emerges. The administration does not aim to replace or suppress the dominant story of mass layoffs. Rather, it seeks to control how that story is discussed. At the same time, it introduces other high-engagement narratives, not to distract from the economic crisis, but to keep public attention fragmented and emotionally engaged in unresolved debates. This is not about governance in the traditional sense. It is about shaping perception, ensuring that different factions remain invested in ways that prevent a unified backlash. The administration's handling of these events is riddled with contradictions, but these contradictions are not mistakes. They are tools. The release of the Epstein files was advertised as a major revelation. Yet when the documents were made public, they were so heavily redacted that they offered little new information. This should have been predictable to those reviewing the files beforehand, yet instead of acknowledging the underwhelming nature of the release, the administration responded to public frustration by announcing a new investigation into supposedly withheld documents. The sequence of events suggests that the goal was never transparency. The real objective was to generate and then manage public frustration, to sustain engagement, to string along those seeking justice without ever giving them closure, and to ensure that attention remained on the controversy without ever resolving it. A similar contradiction plays out in the handling of Andrew Tate's case. The administration reportedly facilitated his return to the United States despite the serious legal charges against him in Romania and pending allegations in the UK. Yet almost immediately upon his arrival in Florida, Governor Ron DeSantis denounced him and launched an investigation, creating an internal conflict that was neither explained nor resolved. If there had been a clear government stance on Tate, it would have been reflected in either outright support or rejection. Instead, the issue remains ambiguous, allowing both his supporters and his detractors to remain emotionally invested. The lack of resolution is not a failure of governance, but a deliberate strategy. By ensuring that the conversation around Tate remains open-ended, the administration keeps people arguing without ever challenging the system itself. Because this wasn't about justice or morality, but about maintaining tension, giving different factions something to rally around without resolving anything. But perhaps the most telling case is the mass layoffs of federal employees. Unlike Epstein or Tate, the government cannot erase or distract from the layoffs. These are economic realities that directly impact hundreds of thousands of lives. However, rather than justify or address the full consequences of these cuts, the administration simply refuses to frame the discussion around them. There is no effort to shape public understanding of the layoffs' impact, no attempt to define the suffering they will cause or the long-term effects on government services. Instead, other high-engagement issues, Epstein-Tate, ensure that public conversation is scattered, that people discuss layoffs in isolated ways rather than forming a singular dominant narrative about their consequences. The administration does not need to make layoffs disappear. It only needs to prevent public consensus on their meaning. If we stop assuming that these events are being managed in good faith, if we reject the idea that the government is genuinely invested in justice for Epstein's victims, due process for Tate, or a rational approach to economic downsizing, a different picture emerges. The contradictions aren't mistakes or oversights, they are tools of control. The administration's primary concern is not the substance of these issues, but how they can be used to control public engagement. From this perspective, we can see a clear pattern at play: engagement through contradiction. The administration does not seek unity around a single set of values. Instead, it cultivates division within its own base by playing both sides of an issue. This ensures that no single faction becomes dominant enough to demand real accountability. When viewed together, these events follow a pattern. The administration does not intend to solve or resolve major issues. It intends to sustain them. The Epstein files are released in a way that ensures ongoing frustration rather than revelation. The Tate case is handled in a way that guarantees ongoing controversy rather than resolution. The layoffs are allowed to unfold without a coherent public framing, ensuring that their consequences are debated but never fully confronted. This is not about distraction in the traditional sense. It is about control, controlling the conditions of public debate, ensuring that people remain divided, engaged in endless cycles of outrage, but never unified in a way that could challenge the administration itself. Distraction and timing, controversial figures, and legal dramas are deployed at moments of broader political vulnerability. The Epstein files were not released when they were ready. They were released when the administration needed something to redirect attention from the layoffs. The Tate intervention surfaced not when it made legal sense, but when it served a broader strategic function. And none are ever resolved because resolution would mean closure, and closure would free people to step outside the conflict, to see the outcomes, to see themselves. And so no one actually gets what they want. Epstein's most dedicated investigators get dead ends. Tate's supporters and detractors alike get mixed signals. Federal employees get no clarity on their futures. This frustration keeps people engaged but exhausted, permanently reactive rather than proactive. Understanding this framework allows us to see past individual scandals and focus on the deeper mechanisms at play. If we want real change, we need to stop chasing the distractions and start dismantling the systems that make them necessary. The administration thrives on narrative control. It's time to write our own narratives.